Hope that you guys had a great day yesterday. Didn't get any questions or anything like that, but we're going to continue talking about World War One, and so we'll go ahead and jump right into our notes for today. Now, yesterday when we left off, we were looking at Mexico and the relationship between America and Mexico and how America was getting involved. But that wasn't the only country that America was getting involved in. In fact, if you actually go back and you look at Woodrow Wilson and his presidency, he prided himself on not being like Roosevelt in the sense of speaking softly and carrying a big stick, because he said, you know, I don't want to get involved. I want to let these countries develop, and yet he did the exact opposite. So why? Why did he do the opposite? Well, a lot of it had to do with the idea that there was a ton of instability within these countries in Central America or the Caribbean area. Europe didn't have to worry about America getting involved in the first part because America was getting involved all over the place on their side of the world. Even though Wilson said we weren't going to do anything about it, we ended up sending troops to many of the different countries. You know, America sometimes claims that they, at least during this time period, didn't want to get involved. Obviously, our perspective today is vastly different than that. And I think a lot of that started with people like Theodore Roosevelt, as well as Woodrow Wilson. Theodore Roosevelt being, you know what, we need to make other places democracy, we need to civilize them, and Woodrow Wilson being more along the lines of we need to let them or help them be civilized, but sometimes that helping just ends up being intervention. You see in Haiti, for the from 1911 to 1915, they ended up going through 6 leaders. They just gotten overthrown or killed off, and America didn't like that instability. They were worried that Europe would actually send troops over to Haiti to stop that rebellion, even in the midst of World War I, which most likely wouldn't have happened. So America instead sent troops to deal with the issue in Haiti themselves, and they did, but then they stayed. And they stayed for 20 years, and America ran the government of Haiti. The country right next to Haiti, it's on the same island, is the Dominican Republic. Essentially, there was an outbreak there. We were worried about the exact same things, and so we send our Marines in, and we rule there for 10 years. There was a lot of, well, we're not going to war, or different things along those lines, when in reality, all of the facts pointed to America eventually getting involved. Wilson stood up towards the beginning of the war and said, you know what, we're going to have this proclamation of neutrality, very similar to what predecessors of his did when Europe was having their own issues. He said America's not going to take a side during the war, but you know what, it's impossible to not take a side during a world war. Countries have to choose a side, and especially America, but understand that America here isn't going to be united on their decision. And this goes all the way back to, well, who were the people that were coming to America? Well, they were Europeans. Not just people who were English and Irish, but also those who were German. Meaning there's a large portion of America's population that is split between the Allies and the Axis. I bet if I asked you guys in class, what are you descendants of, there'd be a decent amount of people that say British and a decent amount of people that say German. There was this melting pot in America. Yet America felt, even with all of those German immigrants, stronger ties to both England and France, because those are the two countries that America primarily traded with, which means that they're going to continue that trade. They will continue to trade with England, and they will continue to trade with France during the war. The trading with those two countries will make a huge difference in the long run. At this time period, England still probably has the most powerful military, meaning what they're able to do is they're able to blockade Germany. They're able to stop Germany from receiving supplies from the outside world. This means that Germany was suffering, and in fact, starvation was becoming common, whereas England and France were both, for the most part, prospering, at least in context of more than Germany was. So those two countries were surviving while Germany was suffering. So what's the logical conclusion? Well, the logical conclusion is, well, let's stop other countries from being able to trade with England and France. And the primary country that was doing that was America. Well, how did they do that? Well, the Germans during this time period had what were called U-boats, or essentially submarines. And so they declared what would then become known as unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, before I get into unrestricted submarine warfare, I have to talk about some of the rules. You know, war has rules. There's that phrase, all is fair in love and war. In reality, that's not true. There are international rules. And one of the international laws that was around even during the early 1900s was that warships could not sink merchant or passenger ships until there were two conditions that were met. The first of those conditions being that the merchant ship or the passenger ship was carrying weapons. And then the second one was that before the ship could be sunk, the crews and the passengers has to be evacuated from the ship, and then you could sink it. I know it kind of seems crazy, but anyways, what was going on with the Germans here is that they were using their submarines to sink passenger ships, or at least they sent out this warning. This obviously upset Woodrow Wilson, and it upset many Americans, and many Americans start to think of Germany as this oppressive country. There's going to be two events that follow after this. The first is going to be the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania is going to happen in 1915. It is, or it was, a passenger ship, or it was supposed to be a passenger ship, and it is going to get torpedoed off the coast of Ireland and England. Ultimately, 128 Americans will die, as well as somewhere around 1,200 other people will die on this ship. The ship sunk incredibly fast. In less than 20 minutes, it was gone, and all of those lives were also gone. Obviously, America's not going to look at that very positively, but immediately Germany comes out and says it was carrying supplies. And so one of the conditions was met for us to be able to sink it. So what's the truth behind this? We're actually not 100% sure today on exactly what the boat was carrying, but we do know that it did have some military supplies. Whether it was enough to warrant a sinking or not, we're not exactly sure. Divers actually still go down today to see the Lusitania. They didn't have that capability back then. One side was saying there was no military supplies. The other side was saying there is military supplies. But the Lusitania wasn't the only ship that got sunk. Another one, the Sussex, was actually, if I'm not mistaken, a French ship, and there's going to be around 50 Americans that are killed in the sinking of the Sussex. Maybe it's a little bit less than 50, but either way, once again, Germany sank a ship and broke that international law. Eventually, Germany does create what is known as the Sussex Pledge, where they promise to follow international law from that point forward. But you got to understand that they've already done it more than twice, because there are other examples as well. So what's to stop them from doing it other times? Now, at this point, you might just be thinking, America, just go to war. But as I mentioned earlier, America was divided over the issue. And we're in the year 1916. Well, guess what that is? That's an election year right there. And so Woodrow Wilson, who has kept America out of war, is actually going to campaign. One of his slogans is going to be, "He kept us out of the war." And the country was completely divided. There was a group that wanted to go to war and a group that wanted to stay out of war. So Wilson couldn't take them to war by himself. In fact, the president can't just declare war. They have to ask permission from Congress. And eventually, he will ask permission from Congress. And it's going to start when Germany will send a message to Mexico. And I talked about Mexico a little bit earlier and the relationship that America and Mexico had. It was really rocky during this time period. And Mexico will send a letter to Germany. Germany will send a letter to Mexico, and the British will actually decipher it. And essentially, it says something along these lines right here. It says, if America gets involved, Mexico, we want you to go to war with America so they can't send troops over to Germany. Once we win, we'll send German troops over, and we will give you part of the land that they took back. This becomes known as the Zimmerman Telegram. Well, obviously, the British decipher it. They immediately send it off to America, and they're incredibly excited. And there were a lot of Americans that just flat out believed that this was a lie, because they were like, there's no way that something like this would actually be true. And then they found out that it was true. So out of the two parties, one of the groups that didn't want to go to war, they were on the border with Mexico. Now all of a sudden their land is talked about as being taken away. So this actually becomes a uniting factor that pushes America over the line and allows them to go to war. And April 6th, 1917, America will enter World War I. There were other factors that were playing into the war itself. Some of it was just looking at what was going on in Europe physically to the people who were fighting. It was awful. there were hundreds of thousands of men. By the end of it, there's going to be millions of men that are going to be killed off or wounded mortally during this war. It's going to leave a massive scar, a scar that gets a little bit overlooked today only because of what happened in World War II. So how would America prepare for this war? Well, immediately when we declared war, our military, or the men that were ready to go fight, we had less than 400,000. By the end of the war, that number is going to be just under 4 million. That means that beginning to end, our military multiplies by 10 in size. In 1917, all men between 21 and 30 could be drafted, but eventually that is going to change with the Selective Service Act, which is going to change it between the ages of 18 to 45. Now all of a sudden 18-year-olds could be sent over to fight. The total number of Americans in the military during the conflict would exceed 4 million, and about half of those would actually be transported to France to fight, meaning there's going to be about 2 million that are actually sent over to fight. When they actually do arrive, they get this nickname. They're called the Doughboys. And it has to do with them being fresh, essentially. You could say fresh off the boat. And there became this discussion very quickly into America arriving in Europe, which was, do those troops go to the front lines and fight, or do they get time to make themselves at home, you could say? Obviously, there's a war going on, so it's not like they're making themselves at home, but do they get a little bit of experience in the back lines, understanding what's going on, or do they get sent to the front lines immediately? Now, the debate had to do with this right here. Obviously, Americans are going to say, yes, give us time to get on our feet, to give us a little bit of experience so that we don't just die in the front lines, and yet the French troops and the British troops are thinking in their minds, we've been fighting for 3 years. We've shed enough blood. You guys are now here. You need to go fight. What do you guys think? There's a discussion on Classroom. Do you think that the Americans should have been sent to the front lines immediately, or should they have been given time to get used to what World War I was like? And then a last discussion question that I have before we end our time. Do you think that enough was done to actually get America to go fight? We looked at the unrestricted submarine warfare. We looked at the sinking of the Lusitania and the Sussex and the killing of several Americans. And then we looked at the Zimmerman telegram. Was that enough for America to not just get involved in World War I, but to send troops to Europe to fight in World War I?